Hello, welcome everybody to the World in a Historic House seminar. This is our last meeting of the term, so many thanks to all our attendees and to our speakers for a term of what's been some really varied and stimulating sessions. If you missed any of them, they are all available, as are all our past seminars, online at the IHR podcast website. And I'm going to post a link to the most recent session, which was the 11th of November with English Heritage, in the chat shortly. After today, we'll be joining you again. We'll be back together on the 20th of January, when we're going to be hearing from some members of Historic Houses, formerly the Historic Houses Association, who are going to be discussing their own properties in the context of investigating links to slavery and colonialism. So please put the date in your diary, 20th of January, and booking link and further information will be available via the usual channels very shortly. As will our timetable for the remainder of the academic year. We've got some really exciting papers lined up, which range far and wide globally. Just one point of interest is that the British Art Studies most recent journal has just been released, I think just a couple of days ago, and it's entitled Rediscovering the British Decorative Arts. Lots of kind of, shortish, really great pieces, many of which intersect with kind of the decorative arts and broader global histories and colonialism. So we thought that would be of interest to the regular attendees of our seminar. So that's it. I think just to say we're very pleased to be joined today by our guest host, John Stobart, Professor of History at Manchester Metropolitan University, who I'm sure you'll all know for his work on colonialism, on consumption and the country house. He's put together today's session entitled Global Goods in the European Country House, circa 1700 to 1830. So a very warm welcome to John and to his speakers. Thank you for being here. And I'm going to hand over now. But as I say, do keep questions and comments coming in the chat. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Elizabeth and Amy, for hosting this, and thanks for letting us present some of this work to this wider audience. The seminar today links to a kind of a collection of essays that I'm currently assembling, and I noticed some of the other participants in the seminar are also involved in that project. Both the papers today and the essays in the book kind of build on very much the ideas that are being discussed through this series of seminars. The recent kind of revisioning of the country house, giving kind of due weight to its relationship with global systems of supply, processes of colonialism, of empire, and so on. That's a kind of a refocusing that I think is particularly prominent in the Anglophone world. And there's a danger, I think, that our kind of focus on Britain and on empire in a kind of a British context, I suppose, can rather too easily lead us to a very particular view of country houses and their relationship with the wider world, both in terms of owners and occupants, and indeed the material goods found in these houses. So the three papers today are seeking to offer not so much a corrective to that, but certainly a broadening out of the discussion into a kind of a wider European context. So they're exploring the ownership and the meaning of global goods outside the usual context of kind of imperial powers, either in Britain or elsewhere in Europe. So we're deliberately not looking at places like France and the Dutch Republic. We're looking beyond that to three regions which maybe we might see them as lying at the periphery, the margins of global Europe, though I think there's a sort of a problem of this language of kind of centre, periphery, kind of margin and metropole. So we're going to be looking at instances from Sweden, from Württemberg, I think, focusing there in Germany and in Kingdom of Naples. What these papers do together, I think, is tell us a lot about the global engagement of elites and about the impact of the global on the local in these three very, very different settings. What I'm proposing to do is we take each of the papers in turns. So we'll have about 15 minutes for the presentations, and then we'll have questions after each of the presentations. And hopefully then still have some time at the end for a more general discussion. Please do put your questions into the chat and we can pick those up and address them for each paper, or if there are more general questions, we can pick those up towards the end. So the first paper is given by Gudrun, Andersson and Göran Ulvang. Göran, do you want to share your screen now? And whilst you're doing that, I can introduce you both. Thank you. Both Gudrun and Göran are at Uppsala University in Sweden. Gudrun is an associate professor in the Department of History. She's written extensively on material culture, fashion and gender in the domestic setting, and is currently working on diaries of the middling sort in the early 19th century and the material culture of Uppsala professors in the late 18th century. Göran is associate professor in the Department of Economic History. So in Uppsala, they still have separate departments for history and economic history. He's currently running projects on the church as a local bank in the 18th and 19th century. This is in Sweden. The organisation of fire insurance in the Swedish countryside in the late 18th, early 19th century. And he's worked extensively on manners in Sweden from 1690 to the present day, and is a member of the Encounter steering group. And I'm sure we can talk more about Encounter as an organisation later on. So I'll pass over to, I'm not quite sure who's kicking us off, Göran or Gudrun, but whoever is, I'll hand over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting us to this seminar. Can you hear me, everyone?
Yes.
Yeah, good, thanks. And we thought we had 20 minutes, not 15, but we will do our best to make it
I'm sure you'll
as short as possible. Well, thank you again. And we were going to talk about mahogany wood, sugar and porcelain, global goods and foodstuff in the 18th century Swedish Count Spans family. And before we start to talk about the actual goods, we have to have a brief history of Sweden, because Sweden have a very different development compared to the UK. Firstly, the country had a vast area of land, mostly forest, but a very small population. Only 13% of the area was arable land. The towns were small, the roads bad, and there were no canals. So there were in general lousy geographical conditions for a transition to a capitalistic economy. Sweden was also characterized by a very strong centralized government, supported by the freehold farmers who owned around 1/3 of the land. A strong mercantilistic policy favored the production of iron in the mining districts, forced the trade on the Baltic Sea to Stockholm, and there were, of course, high tolls on imported goods. Not to mention all the troubles the authorities went through to limit the trade and traveling on the countryside in order to favor the town's commercial life. When Sweden became more involved in the global trade system in the 18th century and simultaneously developed through an agricultural revolution, the regulations came under severe pressure. It took then about 100 years until freedom of trade was fully introduced in 1864. An increased population in the 18th century, together with the agricultural revolution, the expanding iron export, and government-supported textile industries in the towns, led to a growth in wealth in almost all classes, and of course to a consumer revolution. The noble families owned around 1/3 of the land. The privileges gave the nobility the right to sell and travel freely, which enabled them to purchase a wide range of goods on both the European and global market. The towns were of course important for the Swedish elite, especially Stockholm, the capital of Sweden, and the growing demand in the elite for high quality goods and comfortable homes, combined with the government's attempt to create a strong domestic industry, led to the establishment of well-educated craftsmen in Stockholm, many of them trained in Paris or London. The local towns, on the other hand, had few things to offer the manor-owning class. The foundation for the elite's position was the estates in kind economy. The owners were all grain, meat, or iron producers, and the dominant part of the work was carried out by tenant farmers and crofters. Leaseholders paying a rent in cash is a mid-19th century phenomenon in Sweden. The privileges also gave the noble owners the right to have their own craftsmen, which otherwise was prohibited on the countryside, with some exceptions. So this means that when discussing the composition and the extent of consumption, we always had to consider the production on the estates. what could be produced on the manor and the estate and what had to be brought in. And this is a case study on the Count Spence family, where we would like to discuss the possession and consumption of global goods, or rather foreign goods, in the light of what just been said. What kind of foreign goods were there in the country houses? Where did they come from? And are there any changes in the consumption pattern during the 18th century? The main sources used for the study are probate inventories and household account books from 2 generations in the Spence family. The wives are the important ones in this case. Probate inventories can be found after almost all noble persons in Sweden. But what makes this interesting is the fact that we have access to household account books kept by the wives, a source seldom preserved in the archives. And both account books stretch over some 10 years and contains information on what bought week by week, which give us the opportunity to analyze what was purchased in 2 noble households in the 1720s and 1790s. And in addition to this, we have combined those with estate account books from the same periods, since purchases could be posted there as well, or in both. So let's start with the assets as they are presented in the probate inventories. The families were almost equal in wealth after the debts been removed. 530,000 Swedish crowns in 1730 and 610,000 crowns in 1802. But the composition of the capital differed a lot between the 2 periods. The 1720 household had most of the assets in cash, demands, and movables, among them a huge part of silver and jewelry, while the value of the estates only made 20%. The Countess was a very successful lender, and some years the revenues from interest payments stood for about around 50% of the yearly income. The 1790 household had a dominating part, 90% of the capital invested in land. And this was partly a result of the ongoing agricultural revolution, which in this area meant a specialization on grain, flour, and liquor production, with increased investments in land reclamation, improved fields, new farmhouses, etc. as a result. The household also had huge debts to both persons and institutional lenders due to the purchases of the estates. The movables made only 2% of the capital. So altogether, this reflects a transition from an older kind of economy, a more conspicuous way of living, to a new, more capitalistic and market-oriented one. And the late 18th century household were less self-sufficient in foodstuff and more market-dependent. The evidences for this transition into a more capitalistic economy are confirmed in the account books. But the information found here also complicate the picture. It doesn't come as a surprise that the 1720 household had a more diverse kind of income, with revenues from both the estates, the count's appointment, and from interest payments, while the 1790 household mainly depended on the revenues from farming, 43%. The 1790 household also had huge revenues from interest payments. When looking at the expenses, things start to get more complicated. The 1720 household put a lot of their capital in movables, clothes, and textiles, altogether 45%, and almost nothing on the estates, which in a way correspond with information in the probate inventory. The sum used on foodstuff seems, though, to be surprisingly large, considering the fact that much of what was bought was ordinary foodstuff like bread, eggs, and meat, and they owned 2 large estates with a very diverse food production. One explanation could be that the 1720 household stayed a lot in Stockholm, and it was easier and cheaper to buy food in place, thus avoiding the cost for transportation from the estates and for storage. Or maybe the county just preferred the foodstuff that was in Stockholm. We don't know. It comes not as a surprise that the 1790 household had to use a great part of the capital on interest payments, in total 80%, nor that it had huge investments in the estates. One would expect that the 1790 household would have lower costs for textiles, clothes, and movables, since the prices on those decreased in general during the 18th century, and it also seems to be the case. Only 20% of the capital went to those categories, compared with 45% in the 1720 household. But there is another thinkable explanation. As you might see in the table, the cost for employees was both higher and took a greater part of the capital in the 1790s compared with the 1720s. And this is rather peculiar, since we had lower real wages at the time, and it's also well known that the exploitation of the tenants increased in this period, with the number of day works per tenant more than doubled. The The 1790 household was considerably larger than that in the 1720s. The Countess Oxenstierna in the 1720s had around 8 people in her service, 4 maidens, a farmhand, and 3 farm maidens. The 1790 household contained 15 servants, 7 maidens, 2 of them were chambermaids, were 3 house maidens and 2 farm maidens, 3 male servants, and 5 farmhands. A larger household like this could indicate a striving for a more comfortable life. But a large household could also be the result of a choice of increasing the home production, if that was considered to be more profitable. Because the account books clearly show that many of the maidens, as well as the tenant wives, were occupied with production of textiles and clothes. And this kind of home production could perhaps also explain the lower cost for foodstuff. The account books contain many posts with tenants delivering locally produced food, berries, poultry, eggs, meat, vegetables, etc. And this is quite contradictory. In a time of consumer revolution and market integration, one would maybe think that the 1790 household would be more integrated than the 1720 household, but apparently not. And it's obvious that we had to dig deeper in how the household acted in this transition to a more capitalistic economy. And now Gudrun will tell us more about the purchases of foreign goods in the Spence family in this fascinating period.
Thank you, Göran. Now you all have seen a lot of numbers, and I will continue with numbers, but I will focus more on the global and European goods and not repeating that much of the overall picture. The possessions from the inventory in 1735 shows, as Göran said, a large amount of assets in silver, as in jewelry and furniture primarily. And we have presented these tables listing using the categories used in the inventories. They always start with the more precious items such as jewelry, gold, silver, followed by other metal materials, household, kitchenware, textiles, furniture, and books. So a striking category is jewelry, which is comparable to the value of all the furniture in the inventory. Moving further, we have tried to identify global and European goods from the scarce information we have in the inventories and account books. We have had to make educated guesses for the categories, and we have some that is definitely global, goods that are global or European, some that are European, and some that are possibly European. But looking at the possession from 1735, we see that a quarter of the possessions and movables have some foreign origin. So next slide.
Oh, sorry.
Taking a closer look over what it consisted of, it becomes obvious that oriental pearls and diamonds explain both the high value and the global elements of the jewelry. The inventory lists one item with 51 smaller and 3 larger diamonds worth almost $1,000 copper mint, a cross with 7 brilliants, a pair of bracelets containing no less than 822 pearls, and the list continues, showing all these valuable assets, which have a value economically as well as socially when displaying status. Looking at the furniture, there is only one global item, a smaller ebony casket. These images are not from the Spence family, but things I found on the internet. But just to give an image of what it might have looked like, the drawer of the mahogany, the European furniture were described as English or Dutch, presumably due to well-established trade routes with these countries, as opposed to trade routes with France. Examples from the inventories are walnut chest of drawers, and the images here are from Sweden. An English wall clock, English wicker chairs, Dutch paintings, etc. So next image. Moving on towards the end of the century, there is a considerably lower value for movables, as Göran pointed out. And the values are drastically reduced for silver and jewelry. Instead, furniture makes up half of the movables, and the value of textiles has also increased. Again, about a quarter of the movables have some foreign origin, especially the jewelry again then. Regarding the porcelain, a lot of the porcelain is now referring to a European origin, and that is English porcelain instead of porcelain from far away. Next image, show some. Looking closer at these items then, it's obvious that the mahogany has replaced walnut tree as the most valuable kind of wood for furniture making. There are chests of drawers, smaller cabinets, armchairs, tea tables made of mahogany. There are also several sets of porcelain, which is a novelty. Instead of having only a few porcelain items, they have a whole sets to lay the table. So the inventories show that both the Spence family, they owned several global and European goods, but not as conspicuous as we might have anticipated. But there are other important goods that are not displayed in the inventories, but that have global connections. So next, please. Looking at the purchases from the first period is dominated by foodstuff, a lot of money spent on food, followed by clothes. There are relatively few global elements, some European, especially for the textiles. If we look closer at the foodstuff, so we can of course see a high percentage of global influence, global or European, and not least for the spices. Among the spices, we will find the cinnamon, pepper, nutmeg, ginger, saffron. And there is also a high amount of fruit and vegetables with global or European origin. And the high amount of beverage imported from Europe refers to quite a variety of red and white wines, sherries, etc. So this is the first period, and then we have the second period. Foodstuff is still the largest sum for purchases, closely followed by textiles that has, as Göran hinted, replaced the consumption of clothes, ready-made clothes. There are even fewer foreign elements, also concerning foodstuff. Next. Spices then, still imported, and here we have some established global elements, at about 20%. A much smaller part of fruits are foreign, which indicates an increased purchase of local products or products from their own gardens. A notable change is also that the beverage has almost disappeared, again, probably replaced by local products. So although global and European goods were consumed literally in this respect, we want to emphasize that most of the foodstuff was produced at this date or bought locally. Next. It is well known that the 18th century Swedish culture was very much influenced by France, especially among the high strata of society, like the one we're looking at here. But looking at the Spence family, there are almost no specific traces of French goods. Instead, we find numerous references to English goods and some Dutch goods. So in the cultural battle between France and England, England stands as a winner from our perspective, from the periphery, if you want to put it like that. Next. But still, the material culture surrounding the elite was characterized by a national, a very Swedish culture, where domestic products, often of high quality, dominated the homes and the dinner tables, garnished with foreign elements. I'll show you one quick example before I conclude. Next, please. Two paintings which have been studied by, among others, art historian Carolina Brown. And she shows this Swedish distinctive feature in the absence of dressing tables in Swedish paintings. She has looked at several paintings. The ladies in these paintings are both conducting businesses with a milliner, but where the French lady is sitting by her dressing table, the Swedish one is depicted with a writing table. In other paintings, a sewing table. And Brown interprets this as an ambition for the Swedish elite to interact with continental ideals and at the same time distance themselves from too much foreign influence, and instead emphasizing a national identity. To conclude then, as we have found that global and European elements foremost existed among expendable goods, especially foodstuff, and there's no clear distinction in between global and European goods. So our hypothesis is that status is made by imported goods, but it doesn't matter that much if it's from Europe or from more far away countries. Next. There is also notable English influence combined with strong domestic preferences. Thank you.
Thank you very much to you both. Very efficient presentation there. We do have time for questions, and I can see 3 that have come in, and there may be others on their way as well. If we deal with these in the order they've appeared, I think Mimi Schmidt makes, I think, a kind of a comment rather than a question, but I think it's also it can be framed as a question, and that's the kind of the role that perhaps religion played in this. Do you see that as being something that is significant in shaping the consumption that you're seeing within this particular house? Maybe there isn't a comparison to draw from other houses in Sweden, but do you see it as having any significance?
I would say no.
No, I mean, religion was, of course, a part of the daily life in 18th century Sweden. But we have few evidences that it actually have affected the purchases of goods in that way. I can't see it, but of course it's a part of the moral of society at that time. We have this rather strong national movement in the 18th century Sweden, building up a domestic industry and all that. And that's connected to some religious issues, of course, and the hierarchy of the household and society and all that, but no specific religious, or what do you say, Gudrun?
Yes, I agree. I think Sweden is a very special case when it comes to religion, because religion is not such a kind of big deal in early modern Sweden, since we're all Protestant very early, and that's a very convenient solution for the society, and no clashes between different religious groups, etc. So I think Swedes usually do not pay that much attention to religion, and we don't either.
we maybe return to this question in terms of other influences, but I think if we can pick up some of the other questions that have been posed as well. Andrew Han is asking, I think this is an interesting sort of methodological question about the designation of consumer goods as global or European. So are they designated on the basis of the origin of the raw material, or on the where the processing or manufacture took place? So, for example, is a mahogany chair, is that a global good or is that a European good?
Well, we do have problems with this categorizing the objects. That's why we have this maybe global, maybe European, probably European.
Yeah.
But mahogany, we would call that a global good. But of course, it's imported in as wood and then manufactured in Sweden by the carpenters there. So it's a bit complicated, but yeah, we do have problems, and we will of course discuss this in the coming article Yeah.
And so I suppose on the tables that you showed are those kinds of item, are those things that sit in that global stroke European?
Yes, probably.
Yeah.
Or do you say otherwise, Göran?
Yeah. And I have no more comments. It's complicated, yeah.
Okay.
But I'm sure we have to have a better discussion in this in the article.
The problem it might be that Sweden doesn't have the direct trade routes to kind of the global world, as did England and the Netherlands, for example. So most of the goods coming to Sweden are have been through Amsterdam or London or somewhere, and then to Sweden. So even if it was of a mahogany table, if it's from Amsterdam, but then originally from another place, it's hard to know where to put it.
Yeah, it's that kind of lots of intermediate stages make it much more complicated.
Which also diminishes the explicit global influence, I think.
So a third question that we have, again, which I think is very important. The Spence family have, I think, clearly they have a house in Stockholm as well as their country house. I think they have several houses. Is there a kind of a distinction between those houses in terms of the kinds of goods they contain, and maybe perhaps a sort of a different balance between the sort of the global and the European?
Yeah. Well, they have, of course. I mean, the late 18th century family. I mean, they own 5 manor houses. So, and they can't be in all the houses at the same time. So it's Salnecke, which is the main estate for them, and then they are about 1 month a year at Gränsholmen. So I would say that most of the global goods you find in Salnecke and the house in Uppsala that they have at that time, establishing a household for the sons who are going to study at the university. So there you have a large amount of mahogany furniture, for example, but not that much in their smaller estates far away from Stockholm.
And I suppose a sort of follow-up to that is that because these houses are doing a different job for the family, or is it because it's kind of, it's a small place, we're not bothered about it, we never go there?
Yeah, probably. But what is interesting is that it's a huge difference between the early 18th century and the late 18th century, where they buy the stuff, because in the early 18th century, they buy almost all global goods and vegetables in Stockholm. But in the late 18th century, you can actually buy oranges on the countryside in a small town. So that it's obvious that we have a market integration in Sweden during the 18th century, and also some of the global goods reach the countryside, small towns, and even fairs, perhaps.
I'm just mindful of the time. I think